Hello everyone. Today we are going to create a beginner chatbot with Streamlit Python and ChatGPT's GPT 3.5 model, and it is going to be a conversational chatbot as compared to stateless chatbots. We all know that AI technologies have progressed to a point where humans are now engaging in chat-like interaction with chatbots. That is creating an experience that closely resembles human conversation. And at the core of this development lies large language models. One such model called GPT, on which ChatGPT is based, has gained considerable popularity in the recent months. And there have been chatbots present over the internet for quite some time in the past as well, but they have an inherent limitation of not remembering the context of the conversation. This happens because they are stateless or they lack memory. So let's look at an example here. So you see a stateless chatbot. In this chat kind of chatbot, the user asks a question. So for example, the user asks, "Tell me the species of XYZ animal." Then the chatbot answers, "The species of XYZ animal are," whatever the response to that question is. Now, if you ask the chatbot, or if the user asks the chatbot, "What is the animal that we are talking about?" The chatbot or the stateless chatbot does not have enough context or any context at all to remember in context the past conversation and tell you what was the actual conversation about. So this is a typical example of a stateless chatbot. Now we will look at the other side of the coin. We will now create a chatbot that remembers the context and past conversations using ChatGPT's GPT 3.5 model. So now let's look at the flow of the chatbot first of all, or the workflow in which the chatbot will work. So the first thing would be packages or libraries that we need to make or set up this chatbot. Then the second thing would be setting up a session that remembers the conversation of the chat. Then we'll follow it by creating an input widget that takes in OpenAI API key. Then we'll follow it by creating an actual GPT-3 model object instance that we can chat with. Following that, we'll create a user input widget where you can or a user can ask their queries. And finally, we'll pass that user input to the model and get its output and show all the chat responses that we have. For packages, we'll need three. One is Streamlit, second one is OpenAI, and then third is LangChain. Streamlit is to create a web interface that will run a chatbot. You can install it using pip install Streamlit. I already have it installed, so do not worry about these errors. Then the second one would be OpenAI. They are a research and deployment company that created the GPT-3, GPT 3.5, and GPT-4 models. You can install it using pip install OpenAI. I have already installed this as well. And then the third one is LangChain. It is a Python package that offers a consistent interface for memory and a range of memory implementations for chatbots. You can install it using pip install LangChain. I also have this installed already. Now let's import all of our needed libraries. So you can import Streamlit like this. Then I'm going to import some LangChain related packages or APIs and methods. So here you see we have imported a lot of things. Let me explain to you one by one what are they. So the first one that we have imported is conversation chain. Conversation chain is a simple memory that remembers past inputs and outputs. It adds them to the model in the context that is passed. Conversation entity memory is a complex form of memory that remembers information about specific entities in the conversation. So if you remember the stateless memory example or stateless chatbot example, here the specific entity in that particular case would be the animal that we were talking about. Now, upon creating a conversation chain in LangChain, it needs to be provided with a prompt for the conversation, and we are using entity memory conversation template for that. And Chat OpenAI is the actual GPT model from OpenAI. Now we have completed our first step. We'll focus on the second step, which is setting up the session to remember the conversation. For now, we are going to store three values in the current session. They are the current user input for the query, the history of all user inputs, the outputs that are generated by the model for each input query. And additionally, we are setting up a nice title on a chatbot page with some informational text. So let's get creating. This generated key will store all the model outputs. This past key will store all the user inputs. And finally, we'll have input that will store the current user input. We'll call a method where we'll write all the code. Here we'll define the title for our bot. Let's say we call it ChatGPT chatbot, like we did for our page. Let's copy that nice little emoticon as well. Now I want to display an informational text as well. I'm using simple markdown here. Okay. Okay, so we are in the correct directory. let's run our model so far. Okay, I had the wrong environment selected, that's why there was this error. Now you can see that's our not so working chatbot, but at least some of it is in action. We see the title that we set up and the message that we set up as well. So now let's move on to the next step, which is creating an input widget for our OpenAPI API key. So after setting up our current session, we are now going to create a mechanism that receives an OpenAI API key as input, and it provides two benefits. One is handling of API key through a file is not required by this option, and it becomes easy to plug in different API keys, and it becomes more deployable, the entire code base, because the user that is using after you have deployed this chatbot anywhere, they can use their own API key. So the way we can define our own API key input is we will create a text input, we have set the type to be password so that once the API key is entered into the browser, it's not visible to anybody. So let's see it in action. We go back to the browser, we rerun the application, and you can see there is a text field available where you can enter your OpenAI API key. Now our next step is to actually create a GPT 3.5 model to chat with. So we assign the GPT 3.5 model to a variable that can be pulled from OpenAI using the chat OpenAI class that we imported earlier. We also define the number of user interactions in the code as well that is remembered as part of the conversation. And then the next step would be to create an entity memory key in session storage that actually stores the entity memory object that we create using conversation entity memory. And finally, in this step, we create a conversation chain using the GPT model, entity memory, and a prompt conversation template that we all imported earlier. So let's get on rolling with our code. So we check first if somebody has entered an API key or not. If somebody has entered API key, we write and then we set our model name. So in official documentation, the model name for GPT 3.5 is, then we create an OpenAI instance. Now we are going to create a conversation in memory object. And as I told you earlier, we are going to assign the number of user interactions that are going to be remembered as context. So for now, we are going to assign that as 3. And we also check if the entity memory is present in the session as well. Okay. And finally, we are going to create the conversation chain object that we are going to use for the conversation with the chatbot. And we are also going to handle the case in case somebody has not written or entered the OpenAI API key. So let's see if it works or not. If we rerun the application, as you can see, since no API key was entered, it says API key received, no API key received. And if I type in anything which is not an actual OpenAI key and click enter, you can see it gives error. Did not find any OpenAI key associated. I'm afraid there was an actual error rather than not being able to associate it as a key. I typed in the so if you see here, and if I open the terminal, you can see it gives me the error. Now let's move to our next step, which is creating the input widget for user. This step is quite similar to creating an input widget for OpenAI API key. The only difference is that we are not setting the type equal to password in the text input method of Streamlit, because we want this field's text to be visible at all time. So let's just copy this only, and once we are done with our API key manipulations, we do it all outside the if condition. So if there is any input present already, we showcase it. We put a placeholder. And we remove the type to be password. And we also add label visibility to be hidden. So now let's see, we rerun. Okay, I think we made an error here. Okay, we forgot a comma. I want to provide a key as well, so that Streamlit recognizes it as unique text input. Let's rerun. So you can see, since it's empty, you don't see anything here at the moment, but a placeholder should have been visible. Okay, let's see. So yeah, you can see that the user input is available. It says what you put there, your chatbot friend, ask away. Now let's move on to the final step, which is passing user input to the model and showing the chat responses. We get the output of the user input query by running it in the conversation object that we created earlier, and we do it by using the run method of the conversation class. And we save the user input and output in the session itself. And lastly, we display all the user inputs and output models using Streamlit's expander method from latest to the earliest. So we check if there is user input added or not. If yes, then we get the output of the model, which we get, as I said, by running it through the conversations run method. We just provide an input, which is our user input, and then we store the user input and the output into a session state. And finally, we display the conversation history using an expander. We run through the conversation from last to first, as I said, from latest to earliest, by iterating through one element at a time, going back to front. So now when we go look at the browser, if we rerun our application, you see there is nothing changed. But in order to see our chatbot in action, we need to provide in an actual OpenAI API key. So I will paste one of my own to see one example. Now that the OpenAI key has been entered, I'm going to answer a question like, okay, tell me the species of tigers. And if I click enter, you should wait a little while before you get the response. Okay, we can check in the terminal if there is some error that is thrown. There was a comma missing in the code, so I fixed the error. Let's rerun our application. I'll enter my OpenAI key. Just a sec. Okay, API key is received. I'm going to ask the question. Okay, it's been running for a while. Let's see if something terminal tells us. Now it's still waiting for a response. Okay, sometimes there is delay, so you can see it gives me the answer of tell me the species of tigers. There are 6 different species of tigers, blah blah blah. So let's see, we want to get more knowledge about Bengal tigers. So I'm going to ask, okay, it took a while, but it gave me the answer that Bengal tigers are one of the most recognizable popular subspecies. So now the context that we were talking about, let's see if it understands the context or not. So if you see here in the last statement, it says the Bengal tiger is also an endangered species with only a few thousand remaining. Let's ask, when did it become endangered? Let's see if it understands and gives us a proper answer. See, it knew that we were talking about Bengal tiger because it gave us the answer that the Bengal tiger has been endangered for several decades. So I did not need to tell what I'm talking about because it remembered the context of the conversation. And in conclusion, I would like to say that we have successfully built a conversational chatbot that remembers the context of the conversation and provides human-like interactions. And you can run the entire Streamlit application using just one command that I showed you earlier. And there are a lot of further customizations possible to this chatbot. They can be adding an option to start a new chat without reloading the web page, or having the option to download the entire conversation, or having the option to select a model from a selection of models, and having the option to modify the number of user interactions k that we set to be changed in real time, or having the option to preview memory storage and preview the memory buffer that the LangChain conversation chains are storing, or adding your own data and converse with the chatbot based on that particular data. You can find the complete Python script in the description box on my GitHub, and I'll see you again next time.